Good afternoon, students. The two units which we will be picking up from the second paper today, and one is basically in which we will be talking about a certain kind of development of theoretical methodological perspectives which the Indian sociology has developed. From where your syllabus begins in terms of ideology, structural functionalism, and structural Marxism. With the three Indian sociologists, prominent Indian sociologists in terms of G.S. Ghurye, M.N. Srinivas, and A.R. Prasad. I know that you are time pressed, it's time for the mains, but somehow or other if you find some time, you might have gone through in terms of the development of Indian sociology and its institutionalization from the colonial period. And not only the sociology but also the social anthropological perspective, the department that is started coming up. Now when we look at the British to the, just after independence, the impact of the American tradition, and then from the 60s we find about a certain kind of Indianized version of Indian sociology. During the 70s and 80s, adopting certain kind of reflective character, and more precisely from the 90s, the way the globalization has started emerging out, the interconnectivity between the nations have started emerging out. The newer kind of dimensions in the Indian sociology, the newer kind of issues were picked up by the Indian sociology. But in the very first day when we were talking about, I had told you that when any one of you is approaching the second paper, you need to remember two lines. That the literature of Indian sociology seems to be as rich as that of the first paper when we are talking about the Western sociology. 1919, 1920, from where the Indian sociology department has started, from Mumbai, from Bombay. Now almost 100 years, more than 100 years has passed. And in this evolution from 1919 to 2024, we are standing and we will be taking your mains. Society has not been static, and Indian sociology has not been static. With its growth, with its institutionalization, it also developed a different kind of theoretical methodological perspectives, developed a certain concepts to understand the Indian society, bringing about the refinement what we had been taught by the British colonial administrators. And in this very perspective, the 6 theoretical perspectives, broadly that has to be remembered by you when you approach the second paper. The ideological, the structuralist, the structural functionalist, a structural Marxist, modernistic, and the subaltern. And you basically try to give some time to understand the basic dimensions, the parameters or propositions of these all 6 theoretical methodological contours. And somewhere you might be aware of few. That ideology, structural functionalism, structural Marxism, modernistic perspective, that has been a part of your understanding in Indian sociology. From the Ranjit Guha's perspective, how to look history from the below, focus on the creativity of the masses, either he is talking about the Dalit, or we are talking about the tribals, or we are talking about the oppressed, or we are talking about the women, that how these very subaltern studies will be coming out. Though broadly when we are looking at the subaltern studies, somewhere or other it seems to be influenced by Antonio Gramsci's writing. And that way you found a portion on subaltern perspective. Try to use this one according to the need disposition of the question. And particularly when you started talking about the perspectives on the study of caste, at least one scholar, Louis Dumont, with which we come to know about the Homo hierarchicus, the book, and we talk about the binary opposition of pure and impure that you might be aware of, which we will talk about today in a brief. Because this is an advanced class, so I cannot go so deep which we could have taken 4 or 5 days in terms of the caste and other kind of perspective, or indulge in other kind of perspective. Louis Dumont's perspective would basically be the structuralist perspective. He introduces the modern structuralism of Claude Lévi-Strauss along with the Hegel in his Homo hierarchicus. So that way structuralism or a structuralist perspective is going to use. Sometimes they ask you the question, the structuralist perspective on caste. So this way, this 6, once again I am saying, ideological number 1, a structuralist number 2, a structural functionalist number 3, a structural Marxist number 4, modernistic number 5, and a subaltern number 6. And that way, the questions on Gandhiji and Ambedkar, on untouchability or the lower caste, that could also be used. The subaltern perspective should be used in terms of the Marxian perspective, could be used in terms of Ambedkar's writing as well in the caste system. While talking about the Dalit one, I talked about that how the Dalit history is basically now talking about the subaltern perspective in the post-colonial construct. Now coming back to the first and the most significant theoretical perspective that emerged in the Indian sociology is basically the ideological one. In a very simple sentence, we can say that ideology is a branch that deals with the interpretation of ancient text and linguistic studies of any ancient culture. And it has been one of the earliest and important perspectives in the understanding of Indian society and its different facets. Ideology basically rests on the assumption that Indian society is unique, and a contextual specification of Indian society and culture can be grasped. I repeat, the contextual specification of Indian society and culture can be understood, can be grasped in reality through the texts. Thus, the ideological approach is also referred to as textual approach. It reflects historical and comparative methods based on the text, and therefore the ideologists use the ancient history, language, epics, religious manuscripts, and sacred texts in the study of society and the social institutions. In the study of Indian society and the different facets of the Indian society. And in this context, can I make a line that when you're talking about the ideological perspective, it could also be referred to as textual view of the social phenomena. Though today there has been or there has emerged the textual variety of ethno-sociology has also emerged out, which try to explore meaning, symbols which are inherent in text and languages of people's own culture. In some of the writings, ideological has also been referred to as a cultural approach, and it has been a hallmark of the different various sociologists in India, in which they had emphasized the role of traditions. However, we need to remember that when an ideological approach has been applied, it has been applied more on the group rather than individual as being the base of social organization. Louis Dumont, D.F. Pocock, if I quote them, so Louis Dumont and D.F. Pocock say that in principle sociology in India at a point of confluence between sociology and ideology, where ideology is the base of people's behavior. The use of ideological approach during the early formative phase of Indian sociology could also be found in the writings of B.N. Seal, B.N. Sarkar. But one of the most prominent scholars to use the ideological approach, popularize the ideological approach is basically G.S. Ghurye, Govind Sadasiv Ghurye. Very versed with the Sanskrit language, and thus he is using this knowledge in understanding of the Indian society and the different facets. And as far as the Gurye's contribution goes, he established sociology in India. It is we talk about, but broadly when looking at it, was a contribution of Gurye, which contributed immensely to the establishment of sociology in India. And when we look at this, the second generation, Indian sociologists, I am talking about after the Gurye, either in terms of M.N. Srinivas, Hidalti Karve, Damle, A.R. Desai, whomsoever you are talking about, they somehow or other have been produced, trained by G.S. Gurye. And I quote one line of M.N. Srinivas, that nothing disguises the fact that Gurye was a giant. Whereas when you look at the Yogendra Singh says that like a discrete butterfly, Gurye moved to the different parts or areas of Indian society with the same erudition and interest. Though when we talk about Indology, that the use of the text epics, but it has also to be known that Gurye was not adverse to the field work. And that way, you now first need to understand the base. That when you look at the Cambridge days of Gurye, he was trained by W.H.R. Rivers and S.C. Haddon. And if you have a bit idea that when you are talking about the diffusionism, the British diffusionism, somewhere one of the important component of British diffusionism would be W.H.R. Rivers. And we find about that trace of diffusionism when we are looking at the early works, either in terms of caste or in terms of gotra. When you look at Gurye's views, we find about that diffusionist touch and how he has been trained through the perspective of the theoretical perspectives of the diffusionism. Gurye applied this one in terms of the caste, gotra, race with the help of ancient religious text, and thus in writing, Indological perspective became significant. I told you that despite his focus on the textual view, he was not adverse to the fieldwork tradition. It means it would be not appropriate to call Gurye an armchair scholar. It means he was not basically favoring the armchair scholar. He utilized his knowledge of Sanskrit and extensively quoted from the Vedas, Sastras and epics to throw light on the different facets of socio-cultural life of Indian society. His works on caste and tribe are still considered to be the most significant one in the Indian sociological tradition. Though he also wrote on casteism, caste and politics, urbanization, and one of the work from where the question has been asked is basically the Indian sadhus. So these are the contributions within which you have to talk about. So we will be talking about Gurye in a caste from the Indological perspective. And we will also be talking about that how Gurye talks about the scheduled tribe in general and Koli tribe of Maharashtra. And you need to remember that when we are talking about the modernization of Indian tradition and we are focusing on the certain modernization hypothesis in Indian sociology, one of the areas of this modernization hypothesis in Indian sociology would be the debate between Very Relevant versus G.S. Gurye in terms of what kind of or what sort of policies would be introduced to the tribal development and administration. That will become the part of the tribal perspective in which we will be talking about the isolationist versus assimilationist perspective. The Jewification versus the Indian tribes being a part of the Indian society. And that way the debate will be going on. And where Gurye would be basically focusing on the assimilationist perspective for the tribal development and administration. Ghurye asserts that most of the tribals have been Hinduized after a long period of contact with the Hindus. Hence, we should not search for their separate identities. This debate would be there in terms of, I said, in terms of various Elvin versus this one, which I will be picking up in the tribes. And thus he considered tribals to be the backward Hindus. He has also cited the examples of the South Central India by quoting Santals, Gonds. The incorporation of the Hindu norms in a tribal lives seems to be a positive step in the process of development. The tribals have adopted or absorbed many Hindu values and style of life, due to which they have given up drinking and have received education, have improved their agriculture, in which the Hindu organizations like Ramakrishna Mission, Arya Samaj has played a very constructive role. Though he talked about the tribals, but he is very skeptical to the socialist perspective or the trend which is emerging among some of the northeast tribe that needs to be checked, he argues. Otherwise, political unity of the country would be damaged. So the two castes which we are just talking about, just today we will be talking about a caste. The certain 6 structural features within which the Gotra and the caste, race, this all we will be talking about. Tribe we will be talking about in terms of the Elvin versus Ghurye's debate, without which we cannot understand. This will be the same debate with which you will be talking about the certain issues of the modernization hypothesis in Indian sociology. Ghurye has also written on urbanization. And there you will be finding about the one word that he is uses, that is urbanization. He remained occupied with the idea of urbanization in his analysis of urbanization, thereby focusing on the process of rural urbanization, which though according to him has not been a simple function of industrial growth. Rather, in India, the process of urbanization started from within the rural India itself, and thus the term urbanization will be coming out. He applied the Sanskritic text to illustrate the very growth of the urban centers, the need of market felt in the rural hinterland, since agricultural development required more markets to exchange the surplus food grains. Consequently, in many rural regions, one part of a big village started functioning as a market, leading to the development of townships, which in turn developed in administrative, judicial and other institutions. In the past, how the urban centers were basically receiving the feudal patronage, which had demands for silk clothes, jewelry, metal artifacts, weapons, leading to the growth of Banaras, Kanchipuram, Moradabad, Jaipur. Ghurye's approach to the rural urban reflects the indigenous source of urbanization. However, during the colonial period, the growth of metropolitan cities or centers altered the Indian life, leading to the emergence of metropolitan economy, which later on dominated village economy. Alright. Now, this is the one perspective which we will be talking about, apart from caste, tribes. The urbanization is another perspective. But one of the important work has also been there in terms of Ghurye, from the Indological perspective, that is the Indian sadhus. And particularly in the Indian sociology of religion, this work occupies a very important place. Ghurye not only extensively wrote on caste, tribes, kinship, urbanization, but also on religion, which he considers fundamental to man, where man becomes conscious of some power beyond his comprehensions. Thus, he argues that religion is at the center of total cultural heritage of man. Religious consciousness is most important one. And thus, he outlines 5 foundations of culture, like religious consciousness, justice, conscience, free pursuit of knowledge and expression, and tolerance, in which religious consciousness is the most significant one, Ghurye argues. In his book Indian Sadhus, he considered a significant sociology of the various sects and the religious centers established by the great Vedantic philosopher, namely Shankaracharya, and other prominent religious practice. In his book, he highlights the paradoxical nature of renunciation in India. As the sadhus or sannyasis is supposed to be detached from all caste norms and all social conventions. The sadhu is outside the society. Yet, since the time of Shankaracharya, Indian society more or less has been guided by the sadhus, who are not only lonely hermits, rather they belong to the monastic orders, reflecting distinctive traditions. The rise of Buddhism and Jainism marked the decline of individual ascetics. However, sadhus have always acted as the arbitrator of religious disputes, have patronized the learning of scriptures, sacred laws, and even defended religion against the external attack. They work for the unity and integration of the country. So that way the Indian sadhu, this will be talking about. Just now in the same today's class, we will be talking about the Gurya's views on caste and other perspective, because this is overlapping kind of. And once you have done the ontological perspective, the textual perspective, a new insight would be brought to the Indian sociology with the emergence of M.N. Srinivas, though trained by Gurye earlier. But if Gurye in the Cambridge days witnessed the impact of W.H.R. Rivers and S.C. Haddon, then M.N. Srinivas in the Cambridge days has witnessed the impact of A.R. Radcliffe Brown and Sir E.E. Vance Pritchard, who were the great names, who were the established names, and more precisely A.R. Radcliffe Brown in the British tradition of structural functionalism. Broadly, when we are talking of the structural functionalism, that could be viewed from the three traditions. The French tradition of structural functionalism, in which the works of Emile Durkheim and Claude Lévi-Strauss will become important. In a British one, the most prominent work is by A.R. Radcliffe Brown, Evans Pritchard, Mayor Fortes, Edmund Leach. So many scholars will be found. And there is yet another classification in which American tradition of structural functionalism becomes significant, in which the two prominent works are by Talcott Parsons and Robert King Martin. However, when we are looking at the structural functionalism and more precisely from the perspective of M.N. Srinivas, the impact of the British structural functionalism seems to be the most significant one. From the first half of the 20th century, Indian sociology witnessed significant theoretical methodological development, and in which M.N. Srinivas would be credited to have applied the structural functionalist perspective in the understanding of Indian society and the different facets. Now, in a simple sentence, when we started going through the Emile Durkheim, more precisely when we talked about the Talcott Parsons and Robert King Martin, the very propositions of the structural functionalism is known to you. But I am just giving you the brief that in the structural functionalism, the notion of function along with the structure seems to be the most pivotal one. However, we need to remember that functional approach to the study of phenomena initially emerged in the biological science. That could be summarized by comparison drawn from biological organism, in which the interrelationship and interdependence between the parts and the whole has been emphasized. So, almost every functionalist, we find about a certain kind of organistic analysis, organistic analogy, in which the work of Herbert Spencer, if you have gone through in a first paper, that became the most significant one. However, let me say, without having any hesitation, the structural functionalism acquired a new dimension in the writings of A.R. Radcliffe Brown, who opines that component of social structure are human beings, and a structure itself being the arrangement of persons in relationship, institutionally defined and regulated. And thus, in his famous book, Structure and Functions in Primitive Society, he argues that human beings are considered to be a complex network of actually existing relations. It is composed of or human beings seems to be connected by a complex network of actually existing relations. Component of a structure are persons who occupy a position in the social structure, which is prone to change but remains stable. He defines function of a social institution in terms of contributions it makes to the maintenance of the whole. Alright. Now with this, when you have known it, at least one line that you need to understand in a Redcliffe Brown, that he writes that the relations between the members of society are organized in terms of rules, norms, certain pattern. Hence, the structure of society may be viewed as the sum total of social relationship governed by norms, and every part of social structure contributes to the maintenance and survival of the whole. So, that way the function will be coming out. I just said that when we are talking about Srinivas, though in India influenced by G.S. Gure, but in the Cambridge days, he was influenced by this British tradition of structural functionalism, in which the impact of Redcliffe Brown and Sir E. Evans Pritchard seems to be important. I quote one line of Srinivas writes that in recent British anthropology, two important concepts, structure and function, have been highlighted, implying that society is a whole, parts are interrelated, groups and categories as a part of social structure are related to each other, which needs to be analyzed empirically, synchronically, contextually to understand stability, harmony, and even change in the system. And thus, this influence makes Srinivas to insist upon the fieldwork, observational methods, rather than the textual book view, thereby manifesting the difference between the book view and the field view debate. Do not forget this line here. That with this impact of structural functionalism, British structural functionalism, Srinivas initiates macro-sociological generalization based on micro-anthropological insights. I repeat that having the influence of this British structural functionalism, now when Srinivas is applying that in Indian society, he basically initiates a macro-sociological generalization based on micro-anthropological sociological insights. And when you say micro-sociological anthropological insights, it will be basically based on the observational studies, it will be basically based on the fieldworks kind of one. Thus, through this macro-micro insight, he provides a new initiatives in Indian sociology, not only to the Indian sociology, but also popularizes the anthropological investigation of small scale communities. He insists on understanding the Indian society not on the basis of Western textbook or from indigenous sacred text, but from direct observational field studies and field experiences. He also argues that sociologists should not be restricted to any time and a soil. Indian sociologists need to be Indianized first to bring out data from inside out, not to rely on only outside in. And this way, emic kind of perspective will be coming up. He makes extensive fieldwork of cooks of Karnataka to describe functional unity by explaining the interaction in the ritual context of different castes, in which the various castes are interdependent, resulting into the emergence of conceptual tools in Indian sociology, like dominant caste with his work on the Rampura in Mysore, Sanskritization with the cooks of Karnataka, and when he was talking about the impact of the colonial rule or colonial impact on the Indian society, then yet another conceptual category comes out, that is westernization. And post independently, when he's talking about it, I talked about In a political sociology, that is basically secularization. So the dominant caste, Sanskritization, Westernization, secularization, these are now the new heuristic devices to explain the Indian society with a different kind of conceptual perspective, in which the contribution of M.N. Srinivas from the structural functions perspective will seem to be the most significant one. Srinivas has written on many aspects or various aspects of Indian society and culture, but he became best known for writing on caste, religion, village community and social change. He basically favored to study Indian society in totality in an attempt to integrate various components and their relationship with one another. Now he considers caste to be a segmentary system divided into subcastes, which are unit of endogamy, whose members follow a common occupation. It is unit of social and ritual life, whose members share a common culture and are governed by the same authoritative body, that is panchayat. Caste panchayat we are talking about. Apart from these factors of subcaste, he also attributes hierarchy, occupational differentiation, restrictions on commensality, pollution, caste panchayat and assemblies to be the attributes of the caste system. The attributes of caste determine the nature of caste relations. Now, in this very perspective, we are talking about the dimensions of M.N. Srinivas. I said that it will be one perspective through which we will be talking about the caste system, the perspectives of the study on the caste system, in which the four thinkers will become the more important one. G.S. Ghurye, M.N. Srinivas, Louis Dumont and Andre Bete, from where the questions are being raised. And when I will be picking up the caste system, I will once again be talking about the M.N. Srinivas and views on the caste. But here, one of the most important dimensions we are talking about is the development of Indian sociology through the certain kind of conceptual perspective. With his work on the Rampura of Mysore, he proposed the concept of dominant caste, and which he attributed the three most significant, that is the numerical strength, control on traditional capital, that is the land, up in the ritual hierarchy. Though later on he also adds education, job in administration, political power in his analysis of dominant caste. And you all know that how the very concept of dominant caste is intricately linked to his concept of Sanskritization. With his work on the cooks of Karnataka, that how this very concept, orthogenetic or Sanskritization is the orthogenetic source of change that has come up. Though earlier he has proposed a term that is called Brahmanization. But when the different kind of other works have started emerging out, he realized that there are other models of imitation as well. And thus he moved to the certain abstract term that is called Sanskritization. And Sanskritization, the term Sanskritization assumes the other models of imitation as well. Now when we are talking about the Brahmanization, we are only talking about the Brahmin model of imitation. But when he moves toward the more abstract term Sanskritization, then the other models of imitation has also been analyzed in it, also been brought within this one. This very concept was used to interpret changes observed in the ritual practices in the life of lower caste. However, the notion of Brahmanization reflected some implicit possibilities of further abstraction into the higher level, resulting into the formation of the concept of Sanskritization as a cultural imitation built in the structure of caste. I repeat simple one line. Sanskritization is cultural imitation built in the structure of caste. The function of Sanskritization is not only to reflect the avenues of upward group mobility, but also to come at par with the upward prejas. As every caste tries to change its rank in the hierarchy by giving up its attributes and try to adopt those of caste above them. The process attempting to change one's rank by giving up attributes that define a caste as low and adopting the attributes that are indicated to higher status is the essence of Sanskritization. I repeat here, the process of attempting to change one's rank by giving up attributes that define a caste as low and adopting the attributes that are indicated of higher status is the essence of Sanskritization. The process essentially involves the change in one's dietary habits from non-vegetarianism to vegetarianism, change in one's occupation from unclean to clean. The attributes of caste become the basis of interaction between the castes. The creation of pattern of interaction and interrelationship is best expressed by Srinivas' use of the concept dominant caste. He also talks about another concept that is called westernization, which he applies to understand and analyze the change from outside, the heterogeneous source of change. That the impact of British rule in Indian society in a structure. The British conquest of India set free a number of forces like political, economic, social, technological, which affected India's social and cultural life profoundly. And at every point, however, with the withdrawal of British from India, didn't mean the cessation of these forces, but on the contrary, their intensification. Alright. So these two concepts explain the process of orthogenetic and heterogenetic source of change. So you talk about that once, circulation we have talked about. And when you say about that, I'm just repeating one line that Srinivas in a post-independent era also picks up the term secularization to denote the process of institutional innovation and ideological formulation after independence to deal with the question of religious groups and minorities. And you are also aware that when talking about the village studies, I said about that how Srinivas' work on village studies is also very significant, which he considers the Indian village is a microcosm of Indian society and civilization. So use it. Use this kind of perspective to understand what the profession of social or structural functionalism are there. Talk about them in Srinivas in terms of the caste, dominant caste, Sanskritization, westernization, secularization, his views on the village. So he pick up on that one on the urban fringe. Alright. And somewhere we will be finding about that how in the regionalism that we are talking about, we picked up the M.N. Srinivas' view. So that way the certain kind of perspective will be there. So apart from these two traditions, yet another theoretical tradition which has been a very important and often has gained more prominence is basically the structural Marxism, in which the work of A.R. Desai seems to be more important. Now when we are doing about the first paper, particularly Karl Marx, we became aware of the dialectical process, the dialectical method. We also became, while talking about the Marx, we became very aware of, comfortable with the historical materialism method. Apply this one. Take out the propositions to understand in terms of the Indian society. And at least it is very now clear that when we are talking about the dialectical materialism or we are talking about the historical materialism, it is the theoretical methodological perspective base in the writings of Karl Marx, in which history, materialism, dialecticism all seems to be involved with one. The contradictions, its resolutions, and also the perspective to study change that could be looked from the Marxian perspective. And you all know that while talking about the Marxism, we made the line that Marxism basically aims to provide a scientific study of society from a class perspective. Society is held together by the modes of production within which conflict arises, class consciousness develops, and class conflict brings change. In a very simple sentence, because we are not to talk about the Marxian proposition. But at least remember one line of mind, that when we are talking about the Marxism and you are applying Marxism in any society, we basically need to remember that Marxist propositions and categories are required to be reformulated and posted against the societal realities of various historical events and phenomena. If we really need to validate them, so whether you will be validating them as universal or particularistic, you basically need to post it in the realities of the society which you are concerned with, where you are basically trying to apply. Though the Marxist Indian thinkers believe that the Indian society and its institutions could best be examined from the Marxist perspective, rather than any other approach, since the only reality is that of material phenomena determining everything else. The material modes of production forms the basic structure of Indian society, and the socio-cultural domain of social relationship and institution constitute the superstructure, infrastructure, suprastructure perspective. In this context, if I could deviate a sudden 2 minutes, D.D. Kosambi, a well-known Marxist historian who applied the Marxist dialectical method in analysis of materialism from Indian social system. Alright? But since we are more concerned of the air decides for not picking up, that apart from the D.D. Kosambi, we will find about Mukherjee's, R.K. Mukherjee, D.P. Mukherjee, I.P. Desai, they all have the Marxist orientation. Though when we talk about Yogendra Singh is basically saying that the most basic Marxist thinking in India was done in 1940s and 50s by the non-sociologists. Alright. However, it is also true that when we are looking at the growth of Indian sociology, we find about that how Marxist perspective emerged as one of the most prominent themes in the theoretical methodological perspective in the Indian society, in which the various Indian scholars have applied the Marxist perspective in their studies of the different facets of the Indian society. But one of the most prominent name has been by R. Desai, who continuously advocated and applied dialectical historical method in his writings by closely linking the works of Marx, Engels and Trotsky. And you all know that in 1953, Desai also took the membership of Trotsky Revolutionary Party and remained the member till 1981. Desai is the pioneer in the introducing modern Marxist approach to the empirical investigation involving bibliographical and field research in the analysis of treatment of Indian social structure. And thus, Desai is basically referred to as doctrinaire Marxist, though he prefers to call himself Marxologist, that is the scientist of Marxism. And he refutes any interpretation of tradition with a reference to religion. अब यहाँ से Marxism will begin from there. He refutes any interpretation of tradition with reference to religion, rituals and festivals, as he considers it to be essentially a secular phenomena, having its base in economy and even originating and developing in economy. Desai's sociological vision was different from most of the scholars of 1960s and 70s, in the sense that when most of the Indian sociologists were preoccupied with a micro perspective, he attempted to study macro phenomena like capitalism, nationalism, class, economic development of village, interface between the state and society, peasant movements through historical material. R. Desai is of the view that the emerging contradiction in Indian process of social transformation arises from growing nexus between capitalist, rural petite bourgeois and the state apparatus, all drawn from similar social roots, RWTS roots, and that thwarts the aspirants of rural and industrial working class by sheer of its power and skillful strategies. But contradictions are not resolved. They are never resolved. Rather, they take a new cumulative form, re-emerging in the forms of protest and social movement. Yes, social movement and protest may will be using it. This I further say that social unrest is rooted in the caprice path of development, bequeathed by the legacy of national movement. And thus, he brings about a new perspective to look at the nature and change in the Indian society. He also developed the field of political sociology in 1960s by applying the Marxist perspective with the use of history. His works on social background of Indian nationalism, the issues of problem of Indian society, urbanization in slums, implication of modernization in Indian society, state in society, peasant struggle, path of development, all are analyzed through the lens of Marxist perspective with the help of historical materialism. और यहाँ से फिर विलेज स्टडी से लेके all the contradictions what the social background for Indian nationalism has come up and how nationalism has been basically been produced, or Indian nationalism seems to be a result of the materialistic condition created by the British colonialism. The British developed a new economic relationship by introducing industrialization and modernization. This economic relationship is predominantly a stabilizing factor in the continuity of traditional institutions in India that could witness change as the economic relationship changes. Alright. And in the same perspective, we could talk about how we apply in terms of the class, a structural Marxist perspective, that how the caste would disintegrate and class perspective will become the more important one. I quote one line of Desai. Here Desai says that caste will disintegrate with the creation of new social and material conditions such as industries, economic growth, Western education, etc. He does not approach tradition from caste, religion or ritual. Rather, he applies dialectical method. He asserts that traditions have their root in India's economy and production relations. So, the path of development, either you were talking about the peasant and agrarian struggle, India after independence, you just bring about the Marxist perspective, the historical materialistic perspective of the Yardesai, and that way you look at the social background of Indian nationalism, and you also talk about the certain kind of paradoxes what modernization might be bringing about. So that way the colonial rule, its impact and the contradictions, the process of development, whatever which has been talked about. You just pick it from there and just go it. Social background of Indian nationalism, one of the very prominent work of Yardesai. So once you have done this one, then I still say that apart from these three, give some time to understanding of a structuralist perspective, modernistic perspective and subaltern perspective. So the three here, what we have talked about, and three others through which we will basically be trying to approach the second paper with empirical works, sociological empirical works. And in this very perspective, we basically need to talk about. And with this, I will be basically moving to yet another unit which seems to be there, where I will be using all these perspectives once again. Except the Marxist perspective, because that is not the part in terms of the perspective of study of caste system. Because no Marxist dimension that has been talked about. But I will be talking about the social class. When talking about the social class, I will give the certain perspective to look at the debate on the caste versus class in India through the theoretical dimension. So that way, only one hearing of yours, once you watch the video, hear the video, it will become much more clear. Now in the same perspective, let us continue that one. The one of the unit today we will be talking about, and which is the easier one. You might have gone through the anyone who is talking about the Indian sociology, or whenever he is preparing for the Indian society. One of the cardinal feature of Indian society and the aspect of social reality what one will come across in the Indian context is basically the presence and prevalence and continuity of the caste system. But I told you very first day that when you are looking at the different units of the first paper, you just try not to leave the second paper, the units which are very similar in orientation and which are very close to the second paper. Thus, the moment we started talking about the social stratification, when we talked about the Western sociology, and one of the perspective through which we try to understand the Western sociology was basically the class.
And yet another example of this social stratification in the contemporary perspective, apart from the class, is the presence and prevalence of the caste system in which the Indian society will be talking about. So whenever the sociologists started studying the organized society, the engagement of sociologists became very evident with the studies of the social stratification as institutionalized inequality or institutionalized structural inequality, in which particularly in the Indian context, as an example of this institutionalized structural inequality in the studies of sociology of social stratification would be the caste system. Though some offbeat question comes out, caste among the Muslims, caste among the Christians, and I don't know whether you are aware of the statement of J. H. Hutton. Then when you are looking at the J. H. Hutton says that when the two religions, Islam and Christianity, being based on the principle of equality, entered India, the elements of caste were in the air from which they could not escape themselves. And in this way, in terms of the conversion and others, you will be finding about the certain elements or presence of the elements of caste among the non-Hindus as well. But when you talk about the caste system, we all know that when we are talking about the caste system, the very prevalence of the caste system has equally attracted the attention of both the Indian sociologist and the non-Indian sociologist. And when sociology, the discipline, emerged during the colonial period, then how the caste was basically viewed as the base of the Hindu social organization. And in this very perspective, till date, despite the certain notion of changes emerging in the caste perspective, I will not hesitate making this statement that caste is still an important element of the social life in Indian society. It represents a very rigid form of stratification based on hereditary status, traditional occupation, endogamy, restrictions on a social relationship, and in a localized group having association with a particular occupation, and also has a particular position in the caste hierarchy. I'm just passing a reference with you in terms of understanding that how the English term caste came from the Portuguese casta signifying breed or kind. And in this very perspective, we will be looking that one. But it is to be remembered that the moment we are talking about it, how it has come from there. When the caste has been traced its origin from the Portuguese or a Spanish kind of. Then the analysis of caste which came to the prominence, what we are aware of today, which we are basically looking at, in a popular use, it became more prominent during the administration or colonialism, where the administrators, missionaries, Western scholars used caste to describe the Indian social system based on caste as a part of Hindu-based system of stratification. However, the debate also emerged that the presence and practice of caste was prevalent right since the Vedic times. And in this context, you might be aware of that how we will be looking at the Trinity model of Varna, caste and a Jati. So that will certain questions on a Varna, caste and a Jati that will be coming out. And once you have done this one, caste, Varna and a Jati, then how the caste finds its origin in the model of Varna, which in a layman's perspective connotes the division of Hindu society into four grades, that is Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. The literal meaning of the Varna is the color, this is one perspective. Yet another interpretation has come of Varna is a Varen, that is to adopt. And that way the debate in terms of the Purushukta, Him, 10th Mandala, Rig Veda, we find about it how the religious perspective that has been divided. But these very four Varnas or the caste which we are talking about in terms of Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra, the upper three, Brahman, Kshatriya and Vaishya, are basically referred to as a Dvija or twice born, and Shudra is basically called the Ekaja. And who has no right to wear the sacred set, that is Upnayan one. Normally, The untouchables were not included in the Varna category. But when you look at the social reality, social interactional pattern, they are part of that world. Thus, apart from the Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, if you include the untouchables, they were referred as Avarna, no Varna category. They were referred as a Panchama or Antejya, who independently were referred as scheduled caste. And today they prefer the term Dalit, within which in a post-colonial construct, the subaltern perspective has emerged out. That part is there, which you talked about in terms of Dalit. So you just give the certain basic such kind of understanding of the perspectives, but you also have a certain newer kind of dimensions to understand apart from the Indological and other kind of perspectives. And that's why I say that when you sometimes find certain new names, certain kind of quotients, they are not new. We have not done our labor. We have not tried to go deep into anticipating the certain nature of quotients. When we are talking about the Varna model, when we are talking about the Varna, caste and Jati kind of perspective, within which one of the work in a contemporary times, a contemporary sociologist in India, one of the work of Dipankar Gupta will become the more important one, who in his book Interrogating Caste provides different analysis by arguing that it is held that empirical studies have disapproved the traditional Indological sociological view of the strict and irreconcilable dichotomy between caste and modern practices. The conceptual framework within which caste is understood has received no major reformation. It is for this reason probably that studies which demonstrate the malleability of caste structure remain at the level of caste studies, and that's why not been able to provide alternative framework. In this context, Dipankar Gupta comes out with the concept of discrete caste, continuous hierarchy and muddled hierarchy. Such kind of questions has been there. So you look it from there in terms of Dipankar Gupta's perspective. And when we talk about this very perspective, when we have talked about this muddled kind of one, discrete caste and the hierarchies, so there that how the universality caste exists first as discrete category, hierarchies comes later, which is reflected in the tales of origin, but this belonging to the depressed caste do not see themselves as impure, rather they regard their current position as outcome of Brahminical constructionism or some chance minded of their ancestor, thus who is untouchable also seems to be muddled. And in this way you pick up this very perspective. So that way the questions on the discrete caste and muddled hierarchy, such kind of questions could be coming up. So you just focus on this one, that how in search of providing the alternative framework to the studies, moving away from the old traditional kind of perspective in which the caste model was explained. Dipankar Gupta in Interrogating Caste introduces some new dimension. And once you have done this one, then in the syllabus, attributes and other perspectives are there, which I always say that don't give any focus. Basically, when we are looking at this four, right from the G.S. Ghurye to the Louis Dumont to the M.N. Srinivas to the Andre Bete, some attributes, some features of the caste would be coming out. You pick up that kind of perspective. But mind me, selection of the question is also important here in terms of fetching your marks. So a bit of political questions when you pick up, that will certainly be giving more scope for your own analysis, for your own critical kind of introspection, and providing much more better answer than a very descriptive kind of perspective. In the perspective of the study of caste system, one of the work, the prominent early work is by G.S. Ghurye, which we just talked about in terms of Indological perspective. And thus the analysis of G.S. Ghurye of the caste system from the Indological perspective remains to be an important insight in the Indian society. I told you that Indology is basically an academic study of history, language and culture of Indian subcontinent, in which the use of religious sacred texts, epics, Vedas, Puranas are most prominent. Gure initiates an Indological perspective in the study of caste system. And in his book, Caste and Race in India, Caste, Class and Occupation, tries to bind sociological and anthropological tradition efficiently. He considers caste as a Brahminical child of Indo-Aryan cultural, cradled in the lands of Ganges and then transferred to the other parts of the country by the Brahmin prospectors. Is it not the impact of diffusionism just I was talking about in terms of that what he witnessed when he was in a Cambridge days come under the influence of W.H.R. Rivers and S.C. Adams? So when you say about this, the Brahminical child of Indo-Aryan culture, cradled in the lands of Ganges and then transferred to the other parts of the country by the Brahmin prospectors, we are finding about the certain traces of diffusionism in the writings of G.S. Gure. Gure says even the endogamy originated in the Brahmins, living in the plains of Ganges, then to the other Brahmins, and later on it is spread to the other parts of the country. Caste is a status group, though he does not view it as a typical Indian phenomena, since inequality based on status can be found in other parts of the world as well. The Hindu society is basically controlled by the normative patterns of caste, in which he brings the model of Varna to distinguish Aryans from the non-Aryans. That also distinguishes Aryans from the Sudras. He acknowledged the racial theory of caste that you are aware of by linking caste with the race and divides India into Indo-Aryan, pre-Dravidian, Mongolian and Mundari races. He argues that in a layman's perspective, the Varna is comparatively a laid-back view, which literally means color, originally used to distinguish Aryans and non-Aryans. Though in Rig Veda the term Varna was not used for any of the classes. In Satpat Brahman, the four Varnas were described as the four classes. The color connotation, however, was so strong that when the social order emerged, these four classes were attributed with the four colors in terms of white, red, yellow and black. And he also outlines the certain structural features of caste like segmental division of society, hierarchy, restrictions on feeding and social interaction, civil and religious disabilities, lack of unrestricted choice of occupation, and restrictions on a marriage. Considers endogamy as an important trait of the caste and also an effective means of ranking the caste. Endogamy and agotra exogamy. It means when you're talking about the caste endogamy and agotra exogamy serve as an integrative mechanism. The rule of endogamy commensuality marks one caste different from another. It is basically an integrated mechanism to organize a caste group in a collectivity in which Hindu religion provides ritual and spiritual guidelines, in which the Brahmins will play an important role in legitimizing the caste and the social order of the caste in that hierarchy. Though Gure also agrees that today the traditional occupational organization is eroding with the enactment of laws, social behavior is becoming moderate and liberal, thereby bringing changes in the caste system. But it is also leading to the emergence of caste loyalties, which in future or on which in future the political consciousness based on caste will emerge, which will basically threatening the national integration. Politicians will use the caste loyalties for their or caste emotions for their bankability for their vote, and which is certainly threaten the unity of Indian society. You just pick up on that very perspective, so that way caste, race, right, gotra, and there we talked about the tribes. I'll be talking about the tribes in terms of the debate. So you talk about this is the one perspective, the ideological perspective of G.S. Gure. Yet another perspective which we just talked about is basically M.N. Srinivas, who will be talking about, or who will be bringing the structural functions perspective in the understanding of the caste or analysis of caste, with the same Cambridge influence of A.R.T.P. Brown and Sir E.E. Evans Pichard. So this introduction of a structural functionalism as a theoretical methodological model in which he will be trying to look at the society as a holistic integrated system with emphasis on the self-perpetuation of the system. It means now the social or a structural functionalism implies that social institutions collectively form a structure. Mind this line better so that you can use that in not only in a caste from the M.N. Srinivas perspective, but you will also be using the same line in terms of the Sanskritization. That cultural limitation built in the structure of caste that we talked about. So, a structural functionalism implies that social institutions collectively form a structure, the function of which is to maintain harmony in the society as a whole, and thus a structural functionalism focuses on certain tenets such as synchronic, empiricism, observation, fieldwork, contextual, interrelationship between the parts. And Srinivas, being trained by the structural functionalism, will be applying that model in the study of Indian society and its different facets. Though he is of the view that to understand the Indian society, Indian sociology will have to stop blind imitation of the West. Indian sociologists need to be indigenous first, so that they could become creative in their approach. Moreover, he also urges the Indian sociologists to move away from the conjecture-based study and thus differentiate between the book view and the field view. Such kind of questions are there, so you pick up from there, thereby emphasizing on objectivity and observational orientation. Srinivas further argues that sociology is universal and is not limited to any time and space, soil, though he does not provide any specific definition of caste, but approaches caste from the features of hierarchy, endogamy with anuloma, purity and pollutions, and association with one or more occupation. Now mind few lines. He views caste as a structural base of Indian society, as an all India phenomenon. A structural base of Indian society, yaad rakhna beta. As an all India phenomenon, in which the most parts of the country, the Brahmins are on the top of the hierarchy and untouchables at the bottom of the hierarchy. However, he argues that the position that each caste occupies in the local hierarchy is unclear. Ab Sanskritization ka base will become more clear to you. That in the hierarchy, each caste, the position each caste occupies is unclear. And thus, one of the most striking feature of the caste system is the lack of clarity in hierarchy, thereby becoming responsible for endless arguments pertaining to ranking. It is for this ambiguity which makes it possible for a caste to rise up in the hierarchy, where each caste tries to prove that he is equal to superior and superior among equals, for which arrangements are advanced to prove superiority. For example, vegetarianism reflects higher status, and drinking alcohol, consuming beef, pork tends to lower the ritual rank of the caste. Likewise, butchery, association with the leatherworks, defiling occupations also tend to lower the ritual ranks of the caste. He though views caste rooted in the Varna, but views Varna as a distorted model that is producing distorted image of the caste. And thus he arguing the Indian sociologists to free themselves from the Varna model, from the Varna. Though he recognizes that Indian sociologists are required to be freeing themselves from the Varna model, but he is also recognizing this fact that it is difficult in part of the Indian sociologists to completely ignore the Varna model. It will be difficult, when I quote, he says that it will be difficult for the Indian sociologists to move away from the Varna model. According to Varna model, there are only 4 Varnas and the untouchables are excluded and are denied most of the privileges. However, it does not mean that they are not the part of the Indian social system. The Varna schemes refers at base only the broader category of caste, in the sense what sociologists understand today, but it is not the effective unit. At the same time, Sudra category subsumes the vast majority of non-Brahminical castes who have little in common, since at one hand it includes the rich, powerful and highly Sanskritized groups, and on the other hand those who have been marginalized in the Indian society. Shudra category reflects a wide structural and cultural variation. He, while portraying the life of the people of India, uses certain indicators and analytical tool to determine the caste status. Yes, a dominant caste will be coming up. And when we with the works on the Rampura of Mysore, and dominant caste would be intricately linked with the concept of Sanskritization that he developed with the cooks of Karnataka. And Sanskritization is not only, we will be talking about it from the structural functions perspective. It is basically providing the avenues for the movement of the caste, lower caste, up the hierarchy. So, in the patterns of inequality, the vertical upward mobility could be witnessed. And Sanskritization is basically a positional change, not a structural change through which the Marxists will be criticizing it. And it emerges as an important linguistic device to understand the orthogenetic source of change. So, in a simple line, I said that when talking about the Sanskritization, what he talked about Brahmanization, and move to the more abstract term that is Sanskritization. So, in a one line, I said that Sanskritization is a cultural limitation built in the structure of caste. But equally, apart from the orthogenetic source of change, Srinivas is also talking about the heterogenetic source of change, within which we talked about the westernization, the impact of the British colonial rule. And now, once we have done this one, then also try to bring about a certain kind of, that they are not the two polar opposites, rather they will be going hand in hand. If at one hand the lower caste imitate the ways of life of upper caste through Sanskritization to improve his caste status, then on the other hand the upper caste relates itself with the process of westernization. So that way the sudden dilemma we can bring about. And this is the perspective through which you will be looking at M.N. Srinivas. Apart from the M.N. Srinivas, yet another important perspective in the study of caste system is basically by Louis Dumont. And I time and again have said that Louis Dumont would be basically initiating the structuralist approach in the study of the caste. And his introduction of structuralism is still considered to be important. Sorry. Important insight in the caste analysis. In his the book Homo Hierarchicus, he provides a structural functions perspective in which the impact of French structuralist Claude Lévi-Strauss and his concept of binary opposition seems to be the more important one. Though it is also true that it was Hegel who first proposed that to understand reality, you need to talk about the idea. That he gave focus on the idea. And in this very perspective, from one hand, the idea taken from the Hegel, on the other hand, from Claude Lévi-Strauss, the opposition of binary opposition. So the moment you find about the sentences like that caste is an idea which divides the beings and the things, such kind of perspective will be talked about. And in this very perspective, we will be looking at the Homo Hierarchicus. And in some forms of the caste system like hierarchy being based on ritualistic status, mutual repulsion, division of labor. And that way we find about that how the ideology of caste divides the beings and things. The people are acting with the ideology of caste in their mind. Alright. The hierarchy of A to Z caste, such kind of statements might have come. So with this, the structuralist perspective in the study of come out, in which the very binary opposition of pure and impure become the more important one, which will not be dividing the beings, it will be dividing the things. One that is encompassed and that which is encompassed. Such kind of a statement he might have gone through. And how through this ideology we will be finding about that how the Dyuja or Ekja is opposed to Dija, Vaisya is opposed to Kshatriya and Brahmin, how the Kshatriya is opposed to the Brahmin. Caste ideology not only divides beings and things but also explains occupational status, power, education, language attributed differently to the different castes. Caste is a fundamental institution and India is governed by the true hierarchical principle of caste system within which pure and impure are the most operative mechanism that could be viewed in terms of some features of the caste system like hierarchy being based on the ritualistic status, mutual repulsion implying rules, contact, separation, division of labor and its interdependence. Dumont is of the view that one way to assign rank into the caste system is relative purity and impurity. अब यहाँ से very simple, purity includes wearing of sacred thread, vegetarianism, non-alcoholism, non-consumption of beefs, respect of cow, whereas impurity includes human cremation, dealing with carcasses, disrespect for cow, consumption of meat and alcohol. And thus there is a further hierarchy between pure and impure, like those who taking milk and fruits are ranked higher than those who take grain. Those who consume beef are ranked lower than those who consume meat. In this way, the hierarchy will be done, Homo erectus, that book, this perspective will be done. However, it is also true here that the two count you need to understand. And look at the nature of questions which have been asked over there. He has been accused of bringing the exterior model, the modern structuralism of Levi-Strauss, and ignoring some other realities in the understanding of the Indian caste system. And particularly in the Indian sociology, particularly in terms of the study of the caste system, and more precisely in the study of the stratification, you will also be finding about the debate between Louis Dumont and Andre Bette. If I could give you one hint, that when he is talking about the caste and class, he relates class with a stratification that is dynamic and relates caste with a hierarchy which is static. So in terms of the stratification and hierarchy, the debate will be entertained, debate will be intensified in the works of the Andre Bette, and one of the very important pioneer in the Indian sociology. And I'm privileged to have heard him speaking live. So that way, at another perspective that has been there is by Andre Bette's perspective on the caste. I said that same structural functionalist perspective, but somewhere the traces of Weberian Trinity model could be witnessed in the analysis or in the Max Weber's analysis on Andre Bette. When you start talking about the stratification, particularly from the Weberian perspectives, we talked about class status in a party. Now here when we are looking at the Weberian, the Andre Bette's perspective, caste, class and power, that way the certain social, economic and political dimensions will be talked about. And thus I say that the structural functionalism is the perspective through which Andre Bette's work could be viewed, but there is also an impact of Weberian perspective on him. With his work on the Sri Puram village in the Tanjore district of Tamil Nadu, his observation is based on synchronic fieldwork tradition. However, it has to be remembered that Bette does not approve the uniformal macro dimension in the analysis of caste. He also does not approve the approach or to approach caste from a static perspective. And he, in this very perspective, he becomes critical of Louis Dumont and is differentiating the stratification with hierarchy. Rather, he favors the interrelationship and interchangeable use between stratification and hierarchy. In this context, he analyzes the stratification as either harmonic, that is a system where norms legitimize inequality, for example, caste system, and disharmonic system where norms legitimize equality, but inequality persists in reality. So that way, this question was there recently in a harmonic, disharmonic. So यहाँ से हार्मोनिक डिसहार्मोनिक उठा लो बेटा. The harmonic disharmonic model of Bethe also reflects changes in the caste system, family, and the gender relations of the Indian society. He considers caste to be fundamental of Indian social system. The argues that no caste is autonomous in itself. Rather, there exists complementarity in which all castes are governed by the certain norms and standards. There is emerging the new dimension in caste, and consequently the new caste have emerged, but no caste should be studied in an autonomous manner. Moreover, no caste should also be studied independent of class and power. And thus, in his book, Caste, Class and Power, we witness the glimpse of a Trinity model. He argues that analysis of caste has to be done on the basis of division of labor, since no caste stratification, economic dimension seems, or in the caste stratification, economic dimension seems to be important. Along with it, another dimension, that is power. People are ranked according to these categories. The new patterns are emerging, consequently affecting the relationship between caste and a power, within which education, opening up of market, improving conditions of depressed class are bringing tremendous changes. Earlier, the land was controlled by the Brahmins. Power was concentrated in their hands. Thus, they maintained their social, economic, and political supremacy. However, opening up of the market has brought the possibility of the lands to be sold in the market. The new legislations have introduced changes. And how now the non-Brahmins, depressed classes, are controlling village panchayats, consequently pushing the traditional elites into the background. Subsequently, power has become independent of class and ownership of land. So that way you pick up this the caste, class and power, the Trinity model, and this kind of questions are emerging, which are easier in terms of understand. Though sometimes they have used the harmonic, disharmonic. Alright, you need to understand when they ask you the discrete caste, with the model hierarchy, it means you have to not approach the caste with a changing perspective, that one. And that way the certain dimensions will be coming out. So, we talk about this in terms of the Andre Bethe's perspective, the harmonic, disharmonic dynamics of change, harmonic society, and this we have talked about. There could yet another be views in terms of, this is very easy to understand in terms of caste, in terms of attributional and interactional views on caste. This is the one question they are asking in terms of the attributional approach. Is caste primarily focused on significant features of the caste? G.S. Gure, usko le lena bhai. G.H. Hutton, endogamy, F.G. Bailey. Alright. Ab thoda sa, but the scholars like F.G. Bailey, McKim Marriott, and other focused on the interactional approach. Baat wahi, they are talking about a similar thing. But if such kind of question comes out, then they are asking the certain short notes in terms of the attributional and interactional views on caste. So pick up the F.G. Bailey, McKim Marriott, and with which we will be finding about how the F.G. Bailey with his feels caste dynamics and identity are united by the principle of segregation and hierarchy. McKim Marriott with his work of the Kisan Gadi will be talking about the interactional perspective. So that way you talk about attributional and interactional perspective. And cultural and structural views on caste will be coming out. Yogendra Singh's perspective will become the more important one. So you talk about the cultural and structural aspect. The structural aspect of caste is explained by accepting it as a general principle of stratification, whereas caste as a cultural system is understood in terms of idea of purity and pollution, notion of hierarchy, segregation. In this domain of the structural and cultural views of the caste, the another perspective emerged when the certain scholars basically, for example, Yogendra Singh added the 4 approaches to the caste by distinguishing between the 2 levels of stratified population: cultural, structural, universalistic, particularistic. ऐसा करके डोमेन से कुछ क्वेश्चन बन सकता है. इसको थोड़ा सा एक बार पढ़ लेने का. But when we are talking about the caste system, let me say in the same length that whenever we are studying the organized society, almost in everywhere in the world, wherever we are studying the organized society, we have always been finding an example where how some segment, some category has been placed lowly. And in this very perspective, we will be talking about the presence of untouchables in the stratified model of caste in Indian context. Occupying the lowly stratum, and how just we talked about when talking about the Varna model in terms of how we talked about Avarna, Panchama or Antejya. And that way, though we do not have any historical evidence that when this untouchability might have emerged out, but basically when you're looking at the different permutation and combination of the anuloma and pratiloma, hypo and hypergamy, basically when you're talking about the pratiloma model, the prohibited model in which the progeny born of the Brahmin mother and the Shudra father was basically termed as a Chandala. So in the different historical periods, how the different terms were used like Chandala, Ati Shudra, Nam Shudra, exterior caste, depressed caste, alright, untouchables. But basically post-independently, consistently they were referred to as a scheduled caste. And I told you that when I'm looking at the very perspective of Dr. Ambedkar says who are scheduled caste, he says scheduled caste are ex-untouchable. In reference to the article 17 you are talking about. But today they prefer this new kind of Varna consciousness that is emerging out. Today they basically prefer the term Dalit, which in some of the post-colonial writings, the subaltern perspective is basically emerging out. Now broadly when we are looking at what are the perspectives, so there have been the three broader perspectives, though we will be talking about a certain perspective. The religious perspective within which the divine theory of origin of caste which comes out, Purushukta him. The another perspective is the racial perspective, which the Aryans versus non-Aryans perspective has been used. The economic perspective has been used with which some traces of Marxist analysis is witnessed, within which untouchability is rooted in the modes of production was highlighted. Moreover, when you are looking at the Louis Dumont, he looked it from the structuralist perspective, pure and impure kind of perspective. The structural Marxists, by using the dialectical perspective, focused on conflict between the upper and the lower. And at the same time, Dr. Ambedkar provides the broken men theory of history, perspective the analysis of untouchability. So that way the certain perspectives could be picked up right from the divine, religious to the racial, to the economic, to the structuralist, to the broken men history of theory of history, so that Ambedkar will come out. The Marxist perspective through which the conflict will be coming out. And I said that when we are talking about that, how the Gandhiji was called the Maharijan, and that way that Dr. Ambedkar considers that the term Harijan is a soothing palliative, which addresses the pain without curing the disease. So that way Ambedkar versus Gandhian views will be coming out, one will be looking caste from top, one will be looking caste from below. So that way such kind of questions have come up. And when we are talking about the Dalit, I said in a Dalit today, the ideological triangulation of Mahatma Phule, Satyashodak Samaj, from where the one question has been there. Dr. Ambedkar is yet another perspective, which is the most important dimension when you're talking about the untouchables and others. And particularly from the Dravidian, when you go into the south, the self-respect movement of E.V. Rama Swami Naikar will become the more important one. So that way this is the ideological triangulation within which the Dalits and untouchables and their issues will be talked about. There could be also a question in terms of positive discrimination or in terms of the policies of reservation, such kind of dimensions could be also raised. But I don't know how we'll be taking the sentence, though it seems very bizarre when I say. But is it true? I always say that when I'm talking about that, how post-independently, when a constitution, through constitution and in reference to Article 17, when the untouchability was abolished. But it's ironic that when you're looking at the contemporary reality, with a different kind of examples every day which is coming to us, untouchability seems to have survived the constitutional ban in India. And most of the newer forms of untouchability is basically post-independent creation, in which the Ghanshyam Shah's work will become the most important one. In a southern one, that how 500-meter long wall was created to separate the Brahmin from the untouchables. How the work also found about in the south, we find about it how if the postman comes to know that the postal addressee is a Dalit, the untouchable, he does not go to deliver them, they will have to come, they will have to travel long to collect their articles, alright. And in most of the cases we are finding about. And one of the greatest violators is government itself in terms of untouchability. Railway, if I say, railway is the one where we find about the most of the scavenging works are being done in all these government institutions. Which is the caste which is doing that one? Was doing it earlier, which is the caste that is doing now? The Sipai could quote Guriya says, only the horizontal mobility has taken place among them. No vertical mobility has taken in their life. Machines have now come to help them. But it was the same caste which was doing the work, which is the same caste which is now doing the work. And in this very perspective, we talk about the new form. And with these new forms, we basically talk about the emergence of the consciousness, new political activism, even with the Dalit consciousness will be emerging out. And relate that one within the backward caste movements which we talked about in terms of M.S. Rao and others. So that way, that linkage would be there. And in this very perspective, talk about the caste system, look at the Varna model. In terms of a Varna model, opposite of this one, we will be talking about Dipankar Gupta's in search of the alternative framework within which the concept of discrete caste and model hierarchy will be coming out. Alright, and then when we are looking at the studies on the perspective of the caste, ideological, J.S. Gure, a structuralist, Louis Dumont, a structural functionalist, M.N. Srinivas and Andre Bethe will come out. But in Andre Bethe, we will also be talking about the impact of the Trinity model of Weber. And there, while talking about this stratification and others, we will be finding about the harmonic and disharmonic, and that quotient is there. So that way, the prepare untouchability you prepare. So that way, the caste and the form, the caste perspective will study, and the untouchability forms and perspective will be coming out. So the newer forms we will talk about. And that way, you just prepare some of the point wise. You have enough time there. Do not count in days, count in hours, so that you will be getting the confidence to prepare that one. But once you prepare such kind of finish, at one go finish it off. These are the points. At the very end, when the sociology paper will come out, I'll just look at this one. Alright, make it. Do not waste your time that today I'll be doing, tomorrow I'll be doing. No. Once you are doing this, do this one at one go, make the points.